Burmese pythons have transformed the entire ecosystem of South Florida.
Python removal is nothing new here in the Sunshine State. From the work of Florida Fish and Wildlife to the annual Python Challenge.
Florida's Everglades have swallowed alligators, drowned cars, and hidden entire ecosystems in a maze of sawgrass and black water. But in recent years, the swamp has been hiding something else, an invader so good at disappearing that wildlife officials have had to consider one of the strangest ideas in the history of American conservation, dropping millions of dead, drug-laced mice from the sky. This isn't science fiction. It's a real chapter of the ongoing war against the Burmese python, and the story behind it says as much about human arrogance as it does about snakes. The Burmese python didn't storm into Florida. It slipped in quietly, through the exotic pet trade, sold as a novelty to people who like the idea of owning something exotic and dangerous looking without fully grasping what that animal would grow into. A python that starts as a 2-foot hatchling in a glass tank can become a 16-foot predator capable of swallowing prey many times its own body width. When owners realized they could no longer manage an animal that size, some released them into the wild. Others likely escaped during storms or from breeding facilities. However it happened, southern Florida's swampland turned out to be almost perfectly suited to a large, heat-loving, water-adapted snake with no natural predators and an endless buffet of native wildlife. By the time researchers understood the scale of the problem, the python was no longer an escaped pet curiosity. It was an entrenched invasive species, and it had already begun reshaping the food web. Studies from the U.S. Geological Survey and Florida wildlife agencies documented sharp declines in the populations of raccoons, opossums, bobcats, and rabbits in areas where pythons had become established. In some heavily affected zones, sightings of these mammals during nighttime surveys dropped by more than 90%. That's not a small dent in local wildlife. That's a fundamental unraveling of who eats whom in one of the most ecologically important wetlands in North America. The reason the python has been so difficult to control comes down to camouflage and reproduction. Their mottled skin blends almost seamlessly into the reeds, shadows, and murky ground of the Everglades, which means a trained hunter can walk within a few feet of one and never notice it. Wildlife biologists have noted that even with dogs, thermal cameras, and experienced trackers, the detection rate is remarkably low. Some studies suggest hunters find roughly one python for every 8 hours of active searching. Meanwhile, a single large female can lay dozens of eggs in one clutch, sometimes numbering close to 100. Missing one female snake in the grass doesn't mean missing one snake. It can mean missing an entire generation. That basic math, the near impossibility of finding every snake by hand, paired with a snake's enormous reproductive potential, is what pushed researchers to look for tools beyond hunting, trapping, and detection dogs. And it's what led them across the Pacific Ocean to an island that had already lived through its own version of this nightmare, Guam. Guam's invasive species crisis didn't involve a giant, headline-grabbing predator. It involved the brown tree snake, a much smaller reptile that likely arrived as a stowaway in military cargo shortly after World War II. Guam's native birds had never evolved alongside a nocturnal, tree-climbing predator like this one, and the consequences were devastating. According to U.S. Geological Survey researchers, the brown tree snake is directly responsible for wiping out or severely reducing most of the island's native forest bird species. By some counts, 10 of Guam's 12 native forest birds disappeared or nearly disappeared because of this single invasive predator. The snake didn't just empty the forests of birdsong. Its removal of insect-eating and seed-dispersing birds altered plant regeneration patterns across the island, and it became notorious for climbing into electrical substations and knocking out power to entire communities. For decades, the USDA's National Wildlife Research Center searched for a way to reach snakes that trapping and hand removal simply couldn't touch. Then researchers discovered something unusual. Acetaminophen, the common pain reliever found in Tylenol, is highly toxic to brown tree snakes even in very small doses, while remaining relatively safe for most other wildlife at the concentrations being used. Peer-reviewed toxicology studies found that around 80 milligrams, a fraction of what's in a single adult dose for a human, is enough to be lethal to an adult brown tree snake, causing a condition called methemoglobinemia that prevents the snake's blood from carrying oxygen properly. The scientific challenge wasn't finding a poison. It was finding a way to deliver that poison only to the target species, in an environment where reaching every snake by hand was effectively impossible. The solution researchers landed on sounds almost absurd on paper. Place a tablet of acetaminophen inside a dead mouse, attach a small biodegradable cardboard strip that acts like a parachute, and drop it from a helicopter, so it catches in the forest canopy rather than falling to the ground. Brown tree snakes are known scavengers as well as hunters, meaning they will readily eat prey they didn't kill themselves, a trait that made them uniquely vulnerable to this kind of bait. According to reporting from National Geographic and peer-reviewed USDA research, this program has been running on Guam in various forms for years, targeting snakes in forested and government-owned land where hand removal is nearly impossible. Risk assessments published by USDA scientists concluded that, under the conditions tested, the benefits to reducing the brown tree snake population outweighed the relatively low risk to non-target species like birds, rodents, and pigs. Guam's success with this method didn't go unnoticed by researchers working on Florida's python problem. If a common painkiller could be turned into a precision weapon against one invasive snake, the obvious question was whether it could do the same against another. And it turns out the biology lined up in a promising way. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Wildlife Research, conducted with support from University of Florida researchers, tested acetaminophen-laced mouse baits on juvenile Burmese pythons and found the toxic ant was, in fact, lethal to them as well. The study noted that young pythons freely consumed baits containing doses of the drug and that acetaminophen showed real promise as a tool for python population control, while also flagging that further research into adult dosing and safe deployment was still needed. This detail matters, because the target of this idea was never really the massive 16-foot pythons that make headlines after being dragged out of the swamp by hand. An adult python of that size hunts far bigger prey, raccoons, birds, even deer, and has little interest in a single dead mouse. The real target was the next generation, hatchlings and juvenile pythons that are small enough to still feed on rodent-sized prey, and that spend much more time climbing through low vegetation than the giants do. Every massive python captured on camera started out as a small, easily overlooked snake hiding in a few inches of grass. From a purely mathematical standpoint, removing a juvenile before it reaches breeding age prevents an entire future generation of pythons, rather than removing just one animal. If the story ended there, it would be one of the cleanest invasive species solutions in recent memory. Borrow a proven method from Guam, adapt the dosage for pythons, and let millions of baited mice quietly work through the Everglades until the python population begins to shrink. But the Everglades is not Guam, and that difference changes the entire risk calculation. Guam is a relatively isolated island where the brown tree snake had already devastated much of the native bird population that the bait program was designed to protect indirectly. The Everglades, by contrast, is one of the most biologically dense and interconnected ecosystems in North America, home to hundreds of bird species, dozens of reptiles, and a long list of mammals, many of which are already under pressure from decades of habitat loss, water management changes, and yes, the python invasion itself. Dropping large numbers of baited mice into that kind of environment doesn't guarantee the bait reaches only its intended target. Some will land in water, where fish, turtles, and aquatic scavengers might investigate them. Some will fall low in the grass instead of catching in a tree, where a raccoon, a possum, bird of prey, or native snake could easily find them first. That last possibility is where things get genuinely complicated. Florida is home to native snake species that play an important ecological role, including the eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake species in North America, and one of the few animals known to prey on other snakes. Conservationists have pointed out the uncomfortable irony that a program meant to help restore balance to the Everglades could accidentally harm the very native predators capable of pushing back against invasive species over time. Removing a natural check on the python population while trying to control that same population would be a strange kind of self-defeating outcome. Then there's the animal that raises the moral stakes the highest, the Florida panther. Cats are well known to be especially sensitive to acetaminophen. Their bodies process the drug very differently than humans do, and a dose that would be considered mild in a person can be dangerous to a cat. The Florida panther population is small, isolated, and closely monitored, with estimates from state wildlife agencies generally placing the entire wild population in the range of a couple hundred individuals. Every single panther death is treated as a significant event for the species' long-term survival. Even though panthers primarily hunt larger prey like deer and hogs, wildlife biologists know that opportunistic scavenging is common among predators, and a dead animal caught low in brush represents an easy, low-effort meal that a panther moving through the area could plausibly encounter. The idea that a conservation tool designed to protect the Everglades could put one of its most endangered residents at risk is exactly the kind of consequence that makes wildlife managers pause before scaling a promising lab result into a landscape-wide program. This tension is part of why the acetaminophen bait idea for pythons has remained largely in the research and small-scale testing phase rather than becoming a large, Guam-style aerial program across the Everglades. The published Florida study on juvenile pythons explicitly called for more research into adult dosing, safe bait deployment, and ways to minimize risk to non-target wildlife before broader use could be responsibly considered. In other words, the science has shown real promise, but the ecological and political hurdles to scaling it up are significant, and no large-scale mousetrap campaign has been rolled out across the Everglades the way it has been used on Guam. Public reaction is its own obstacle. Even a carefully designed, scientifically supported program built around a common household medication is an easy target for alarming headlines. The mental image of raining medicated rodents down onto a wetland is vivid enough to spread quickly, regardless of the underlying science, and any hint of risk to pets, endangered panthers, or beloved native wildlife tends to generate fast, intense public pushback. Wildlife agencies proposing similar biological control tools in the past, from genetically modified mosquitoes to other toxicant-based programs, have run into this same pattern, where technical nuance gets lost and public trust becomes the hardest resource to manage. In the meantime, Florida continues to rely on a broader toolkit rather than betting everything on one method. Python hunters and contractors still patrol roads and levees at night. The state's annual Python Challenge competitions continue to draw participants and public attention. Detection dogs, trained through programs like Auburn University's EcoDogs initiative, have shown real ability to locate snakes that human searchers walk right past, even though heat, terrain, and water limit where they can effectively work. Perhaps the most successful recent tactic has been radio telemetry, implanting trackers in captured male pythons and releasing them as so-called scout snakes, which then lead researchers to breeding aggregations during mating season, allowing multiple pythons to be removed in a single encounter rather than searching blindly for each one. The acetaminophen bait concept remains part of the broader research conversation, a promising tool sitting alongside pheromone lures, environmental DNA sampling, thermal imaging, and reproductive control research, rather than a single miracle fix. And that may be the most honest takeaway from this entire story. Florida's python crisis doesn't have one clean solution waiting to be discovered. It has a long list of imperfect tools, each with real potential and real limitations. And the work of managing an invasive species that's deeply embedded in a complex ecosystem is slow, incremental, and often frustratingly indirect. Somewhere in the Everglades right now, a female python is likely coiled in dense grass near a clutch of eggs, invisible to every camera, dog, and hunter working the area. She doesn't know about laboratory toxicology studies or public hearings or panther population estimates. She only knows warmth, cover, and time. And for now, time is still largely on her side. The story of the dead mouse and the painkiller inside it isn't really about a single dramatic solution defeating an invasive species overnight. It's about how humans, having introduced a problem into a delicate system, are now forced to search for careful, sometimes strange, always imperfect ways to correct it, fully aware that in an ecosystem as alive and interconnected as the Everglades, there is no such thing as a purely simple fix.